Hi, I'm Megan Leigh, and I'm here talking to Lucy Holland about folk tales and her new book, Sistersong. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Megan. I'm Lucy Holland. I wrote this book, Sistersong, and Megan is here helping me out today to just come and chat to you all a little bit about folk tales and rewriting them and why they might be relevant to a 21st century audience.
So, first things first, what are some of your favourite folk tales?
So I tend to like the folk tales with this is going to come as no surprise, but strong female characters who kind of go, they're usually heroines. They're usually like down on their luck. The only problem with these stories is that they kind of end up, winning a handsome prince, which is like slightly kind of boring when you've read like 10,000 of them. But I still think that having women as central figures in folk stories those are all my most of my favorite ones.
And is that something you wanted to sort of tackle when you sort of tried to retell or use an original folk tale, but bring it sort of into the modern audience, something that they would really like?
Yeah, I think that everybody, is. I say this so flippantly. Oh, everybody knows the Two Sisters, and actually, like a really small number of people know the Two Sisters. But like, it's basically a story about sibling rivalry. It's about sexual jealousy. On the surface, you think this is really anti-feminist. This is patriarchal. This is the view of women here. This is pitching sisters against each other, and even the bonds of sisterhood are not strong enough to resist this idea of we have to fight over a man because that's all we are. We just want to fight over a man, and the man is like the prize, and he is the only one who comes out unscathed from the story. So you think, why would I want to retell something like that? And kind of the answer is that I was intrigued by how little we get to hear the sisters' voices in the story. We kind of presented it as like a lot of folk tales, like a fait accompli. It's like, here's what's going to happen, and everyone kind of has a horrible feeling that they know how it's going to end. And it's all we get is the theme of jealousy and sibling rivalry and murder, and this terrible thing. And so I wanted to be like, well, for a sister to kill another sister, that is pretty bad. I mean, where do you even start with that? If they grew up together, clearly they've got years and years of childhood shared experience. How on earth could a stranger just come into one of their lives and just split them up like that? And I think that's what we don't get with folk tales. We don't get this kind of in-depth look at people's thought processes and motivations, and people are very complicated, and I feel like it's quite a gory, ghoulish sort of story, and it's got a lot of shock value. A sister murdering another sister, and then she gets turned into a harp. I mean, like, that is very strong imagery. But I think the story and women's voices kind of get lost in that, so we never really find out who the sisters are as people. We just see that in the ballad that they're, one is jealous of the other and murders her for a man. And that doesn't tell me anything about who these women were. So it's like a gift to a writer, a story like this. It's full of strong imagery, this harp motif, the bone harp, super gruesome, and this rivalry. But rivalry doesn't just spring up out of nowhere. There's always like a foundation for it. So, but it's such a great story. And so that's the kind of thing about doing a retelling. It's taking this fantastic kind of gory tale and looking at it in a bit more depth and trying to make it seem like real people this story could involve real people, not just caricatures.
It's interesting that you say that everyone's heard of the Two Sisters, because absolutely that is not the case. And I would put my hand up as an ignorant Australian and say I had never heard of that before, because it is very much a British folktale. So, I mean, did you want to particularly look at a British folktale, or was that just coincidence? I mean, what is it that's so connected to the land and the area where you are and the area where it's set?
So the Two Sisters isn't necessarily associated with a particular point or place in England. And I also have a feeling that it might not be solely English. This is the case with a lot of folk stories, as you know, you find out it's the same essential story appears in lots of different countries. So they all have a version of it. But this particular version from the child ballads, which was kind of curated by James Child into he went around the country collecting stories. So it was collected from somewhere in England. So it's been around for a long time. And my decision to set it in the West Country was simply because, I live here and it's a really interesting part of the country. It's got a very interesting history. It was fiercely independent for very many years, even when the Romans had established a presence in Britain. The West Country it was still very tribal, and it ruled itself. And that was interesting that even the Saxons, when they replaced the Romans kind of as in an invading force, even then it took them hundreds of years to fully make Dumnonia, which was Devon and Cornwall, part of Wessex. And everyone has heard of Wessex because that's what formed the Kingdom of England. So it's the kind of the founding story of the country. So, but it's a really interesting part of history that nobody knows very much about, and there's really few primary sources, which was a huge headache. But it also meant I could mix stuff up and make it, use this interesting history with this interesting folktale. And because the folk story has elements of magic in it, like the harp, everyone knows sibling rivalry, maybe, murder. That's not such an unusual thing, but being transformed into a harp is pretty unusual. And a lot of folk tales do have this element of magic in them. I love elements. I come from writing fantasy, epic fantasy, so I'm very at home with working with magic and this idea, but I wanted to make it quite a grounded sort of magic. So that feeds into the story of, England and the landscape and where I'm situated right now, which is Devon. So it's very much the folktale. It is quite British because it plays with a lot of British myths and ideas. Picks up very briefly the King Under the Hill, which is related to Arthur, and of the fact that Arthur will return to Albion in its hour of greatest need. I kind of feel like our hour of greatest need has come and gone. Many times I haven't seen this shining knight appearing. I feel like we might have to save ourselves, or like at least the women might have to step up and sort of shit out because no Arthur. But I love the motif of it. I love the idea of the sleeping king, so I had to play with that a little bit as well. And Britain has tons of those kind of they're like geography intersecting with myth and psychology to kind of create this myth of landscape, and that's something that's really interesting. So I do work with a lot of ideas about the land and about reconnecting with the land.
Okay, getting on to what you and I love to talk about most, women and the representations of women. Yay! In folk tales, for instance, specifically here, women have not traditionally had a very large role, and as you said, in this ballad in particular, you never got to hear the women's voices. So you have tackled this in a way to really bring out those voices. I mean, what are some of the kind of worst things you see about women in folk tales, and what did you want to rectify in your retelling?
Well, mostly that. Even though that they're main characters with the Two Sisters, they are the main characters in the story. Even when women are main characters, they lack agency. Most of the time, their stories are being influenced by external events, usually the men around them. The objectives, their rewards that are dangled in front of them, like carrots, are generally male orientated, so like usually a handsome prince. And the obstacles that they have to encounter and overcome are very often other women. So there's this idea of like pitching women against each other and having men as the kind of reward and the support. And I hate that the fact that we have to fight each other is just a really kind of very patriarchal anti-sisterhood thing. And so you get a lot of characters like the evil stepmother and the evil sisters, and these family members who are unsupportive around the poor kind of protagonist. I mean, classic story Cinderella, but the evil stepmother is in loads and loads of fairy tales and folk stories. If we're mothers, we're very often dead. We get killed off. So very often the hero of the story will have a dead parent, and usually if it's a dead parent, it's the mother, because that's more tear-jerking and we feel more deeply about that. But of course, that means that you've already written off another woman, straight away. So she never even appears in the story. So that's another trope that I really hate. I just don't like the fact that even though we're main characters, and even though there are so many women in folk stories, they're never their own story. They're never allowed to tell their own stories, and they're kind of almost like played around with like puppets. And if we go against, very often, even if you go against the grain, like you say, oh no, I'm not going to be a stereotype, I'm not going to fulfill this role, it's usually men who are rewarded for saying that rather than women. So men don't have such a strict set of roles that they have to fulfill in folktales, whereas women are expected to fulfill certain roles, and we're kind of pre-programmed to look for those roles when we read folk stories. So like in the Two Sisters, they're pitched against each other. One is a good virtuous chaste girl, and the other one is an evil harpy lusting after a man who isn't hers. And that's the roles that, and we're, as an audience, we are meant to obviously sympathise with the poor drowned girl who is chaste and virtuous and good-hearted. And that's something that the ballad sets you up to do. And it's what I really hated, and I wanted to be like, okay, no, because there's always two sides to a story. People don't exist in this vacuum of good and evil. They're complicated, and they have complicated relationships. So it's this idea of that I hate most about women being simplified and put into boxes and made to play roles in folk stories. And they're usually the same roles over and over again.
Sistersong sounds amazing, and I am pretty lucky to happen to know that it's amazing. So anyone watching this and you like the sound of what Lucy was talking about and want to see some epic feminist folklore retelling, then go out and get yourself a copy of Sistersong, Lucy Holland's new book from Macmillan. And if you enjoyed our conversation, do check us out. Breaking the Glass Slipper is a bi-monthly podcast, and we love to talk about intersectional feminism, tropes, and just generally chat shit. So I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.